Long before satellites circled the sky, long before charts, barometers, or weather forecasts existed, ordinary people, farmers, travelers, fishermen, and villagers, looked upward and wondered what the next sunrise might bring. Their entire lives depended on the sky. A late frost could ruin a harvest. An unexpected storm could destroy months of work. A sudden shift in wind could change the fate of a whole village. And yet, they had no machines, no scientific tools, no instruments to guide them. Instead, they learned to read the world itself. They studied the color of clouds as carefully as we read words on a page. They watched how birds flew, how animals moved, how the wind touched the grass, how distant hills faded or sharpened. They listened to changes in sound, humidity, and air pressure without ever naming them. They trusted the slow wisdom of the earth, patterns repeated through years of observation, quiet knowledge passed from one generation to the next. And remarkably, many of those ancient techniques still exist inside us today. We feel the heaviness in the air before rain. We sense when a storm is coming. We react to the dimming of sunlight, the shift of wind, the sudden stillness before the sky breaks open. Tonight, we'll travel gently into that world. A world where farmers stood at their doorsteps at dawn, staring at the horizon to decide whether to plant, harvest, or wait. A world where the shape of a cloud could change the rhythm of an entire day. A world where the sky was the only calendar, the wind the only teacher, and the land itself the truest guide. If these calm journeys into forgotten history soothe your mind, help you relax, or simply spark curiosity, I invite you to gently press like, subscribe for more peaceful stories, and leave a soft comment about which weather sign you find most fascinating. Your support helps keep this quiet corner of history alive. Before the world awoke to the sound of clocks, before charts and instruments translated the sky into numbers, the first and most reliable weather tool people ever used was simply the act of looking up. Dawn was not just the beginning of a new day. It was a quiet ritual, a moment of decision, a careful reading of signs written across the sky in shapes, colors, and movements. For early farmers, who depended entirely on nature's rhythm, dawn was their living barometer, and the horizon was a silent guide whispering what the day might bring. They stepped outside before anyone else, often long before the village stirred, standing still as the world brightened from darkness into pale morning light. And in that stillness, they read the sky in a way that now feels both ancient and strangely familiar. The moment between night and sunrise carried a special kind of clarity. The air was cool and still. The land seemed to hold its breath. And in this soft pause, farmers learned to observe details modern people rarely notice. How quickly the light shifted, whether the eastern horizon glowed with a warm tint or a pale, washed-out sheen, whether thin streaks of clouds stretched across the sky or gathered in layered bands near the earth. These signs were not random. They were the accumulated wisdom of hundreds of seasons, each observed carefully, each adding to a great unwritten library of knowledge passed down quietly through generations. If the sky glowed a deep, steady red just before sunrise, farmers often took it as a warning that moisture hung heavily in the air, signaling the possibility of rain later in the day. They had no understanding of atmospheric scattering. All they knew was that certain colors meant certain outcomes, and those patterns proved themselves again and again. A pale yellow sunrise, by contrast, suggested dryness, a calm day ahead, a time suitable for planting, harvesting, or repairing tools in the fields. They did not study wavelengths or horizons. They simply knew what generations before them had known. The sky spoke truth to those who paid attention. Farmers also knew that clouds at dawn could reveal far more than their shapes suggested. Thin wisps stretching across the horizon often meant the day would remain calm, the kind of weather suitable for delicate work like tending seedlings or checking stored grains. But if the clouds moved quickly at dawn, pushed by unseen winds high above, farmers understood that weather might change before midday. These early morning observations helped them decide the entire structure of their day: when to work, when to rest, when to prepare for uncertainty. Today, we may not rely on clouds to structure our hours, but the instinct remains. Many people still feel the truth of an old saying: the sky in the morning tells something, even when we don't fully grasp why. The watchfulness didn't stop at the clouds. Farmers observed the clarity of distant hills, If the hills looked unusually sharp and near, the air was dry and light. But if the hills faded, appearing soft and distant, it meant moisture filled the air, hinting that rain might follow. Even this subtle perception, recognizing changes in the softness of the landscape, still exists subtly in us. Sometimes, without quite knowing why, we sense rain coming because the world appears slightly muted, its colors softer, its outlines smoothed. It is the same instinct medieval and ancient farmers lived by. The direction and texture of light mattered too. Farmers noticed when the rising sun shimmered slightly as though seen through a thin veil of uneven air. They could not explain changes in humidity or temperature layers, but they recognized the pattern. Wavering light meant unstable weather ahead. A smooth, steady sunrise meant calm conditions. This sensitivity was not mystical. It came from thousands of dawns watched with quiet attention. Each morning added a new entry to their mental archive of knowledge. And yet, weather prediction wasn't just about distant signs in the sky. It was about what the air felt like on the skin. A heavy stillness in the air, a subtle thickness against the face, or even a faint sweetness in the breeze provided clues. If the air felt unusually warm at dawn, especially after a cool night, farmers knew moisture was rising and that storms might build later. If the air felt crisp and dry, they relaxed, knowing the land would remain steady throughout the day. This tactile relationship with weather is nearly forgotten now, but occasionally we still feel it. Sometimes we step outside and immediately know, without thinking, that a storm is coming, because the air feels different, heavy, or oddly warm. That feeling is ancient memory speaking through our senses. Birds also played a role in dawn weather reading, long before people understood the relationship between air pressure and animal behavior. Farmers noticed when birds flew unusually low in the morning, skimming fields instead of soaring high. They had no vocabulary for pressure systems, but they recognized the pattern. Low flight meant unsettled air above, often signaling upcoming storms. If birds soared freely with relaxed wings, the sky was safe. Today, we seldom think about why birds behave this way, but the instinct remains in our shared cultural understanding. When birds fly low, rain will follow. The idea didn't come from superstition. It came from countless dawns filled with quiet observation. Even the behavior of insects contributed to early weather prediction. At dawn, farmers listened to the faint hum of insects. If the morning was unusually noisy, they interpreted it as a sign of stable weather. If the fields remained strangely quiet, farmers sensed tension in the air. Something in the environment was shifting, and nature's smallest creatures felt it first. Modern science shows that many insects respond to changes in humidity and pressure, but farmers long ago noticed the same thing simply by listening. All these observations became part of a ritual. A farmer would stand in the quiet morning light, absorbing every detail, letting the environment speak. And this ritual was not rushed. It was unhurried, reflective, and gentle. It allowed farmers to feel connected to the world they depended on. The sky, the land, the air, all were partners in a silent conversation. And though we no longer rely on these signs to plan our survival, we still feel echoes of this connection. A bright sunrise brings a sense of calm. An unusually dark horizon sparks unease. A warm morning breeze feels full of promise. These responses live deep within us, rooted in centuries of dawn watching. The remarkable thing about dawn weather reading is not that it worked, it often did, but that it shaped a mindset of patience and observation. It trained people to begin their days not with urgency, but with awareness. They didn't rush into the fields blindly. They paused first, letting the world tell them what kind of day it would be. And in this slow, mindful beginning, they found stability. Even if the day brought challenges, they felt prepared, grounded by the knowledge of what the sky had whispered at sunrise. Today, our mornings rarely include such stillness. But somewhere inside us, the instinct remains. We glance out windows to see if clouds gather. We notice the color of the horizon even if we don't consciously analyze it. We step outside, feel the air, and know intuitively whether we need a coat, an umbrella, or simply an easier pace for the day. This is not modern habit, it is ancient inheritance. And so, as we explore how people predicted weather before instruments, we begin where every farmer once began, at dawn, standing in the quiet, reading the sky as though it were the first page of the day. The tools were simple: eyes, skin, breath, intuition, but they shaped entire communities. For these early watchers of the morning light, the sky was both teacher and companion, offering guidance not through speech but through the gentle consistency of its patterns. For farmers living centuries before weather instruments existed, the wind was not simply a breeze moving across their fields. It was a messenger, a carrier of distant conditions, a whisper from places far beyond the horizon. It could come from forests, from mountains, from vast stretches of open land, bringing clues about storms, droughts, cold fronts, or gentle days of calm. And so, long before barometers, long before meteorology became a science, people learned to watch the wind with a depth of attention that is difficult for us to imagine today. They listened to it, smelled it, felt it on their skin, and observed how it moved across the landscape. The wind was invisible, yet to them it was more readable than ink on parchment. Many farmers began their day not only by watching the dawn sky, but by stopping for a moment to sense the movement of the air. Sometimes they lifted their chin just slightly, as though the wind would speak directly to them. Sometimes they watched how smoke from a chimney rose or bent. Sometimes they even tossed a small handful of dust or grass into the air, watching how it drifted. These actions seem simple now, almost too simple, yet to those who lived by the land, they held enormous meaning. A slight shift in the wind's direction could change the entire day's plan. One of the first lessons early farmers learned was that winds arriving from different directions brought different weather. Without any understanding of atmospheric science, without any concept of high pressure or low pressure, they knew from experience that certain wind patterns preceded certain outcomes. A warm, dry wind coming from inland regions usually signaled stable weather. A cool wind from the north often brought sudden chills that could damage crops not yet ready for cold. A damp wind from the west hinted that rain might be approaching, even if the sky remained deceptively clear. Farmers memorized these patterns through generations of careful observation, treating directional winds almost like characters in a familiar story, each with its own personality, its own tendencies, its own ways of announcing the day. They also learned to read the speed of the wind. A slow, steady breeze that barely stirred leaves often suggested calm conditions. But a sudden, rapid change in wind speed, especially when the sky did not visibly change, could mean instability was building somewhere beyond sight. This kind of wind, the restless and uneven type, made farmers uneasy. They might choose to delay certain tasks, like spreading grain to dry or leaving tools in the open, because the wind often brought surprises. Even today, we feel something in a sudden gust that seems out of character for the sky overhead. Without understanding why, we sense that nature is shifting, that the atmosphere is unsettled. This instinct is a remnant of the ancient relationship people had with the wind. The wind also carried scents, something farmers knew to pay close attention to. A faint earthy smell, unusually strong even at a distance, often signaled moisture rising from the ground, an early sign of upcoming rain. A dry, dusty scent could suggest a longer dry period ahead. Sometimes the wind brought the scent of distant vegetation, telling farmers that weather patterns were shifting from one region toward another. While modern people rarely think about smelling the wind, we still notice certain things unconsciously. Before a storm, many people remark that the air smells like rain. Without realizing it, we echo ancient farmers whose lives depended on recognizing these subtle chemical changes. The wind's temperature was another clue. Farmers stepped outside and let the wind touch their face, their bare hands, the back of their neck. If the wind felt unexpectedly warm for the season or unusually cool for the time of day, they knew something was changing. Warm winds in cooler seasons often brought moisture, while cool winds in warmer seasons could bring crisp, dry air that prevented storms. Even today, when a warm breeze blows on a cold day or a sudden cool wind arrives in summer, we feel something shift inside us, a recognition inherited from ancestors who learned long ago that temperature changes often preceded weather changes. Farmers also learned to observe how the wind moved across their surroundings. They watched how tree branches swayed, not only whether they moved, but how they moved. A gentle rocking motion in the upper branches of tall trees often meant weather from high altitudes was calm. But if only the lower branches of shrubs and smaller trees moved while the upper branches were still, it meant the wind was traveling unusually close to the ground, a sign of heavier, shifting air often associated with rain. In fields of grain, farmers watched how the wind created ripples across the stalks. Smooth ripples meant consistency. Chaotic patterns meant instability. We still experience this today, noticing how leaves flicker before a storm or how the grass moves differently when rain is nearby. Another fascinating aspect of medieval wind reading was the use of sound. The wind's voice, its pitch, its rhythm, the way it traveled through the landscape, was a tool of prediction. When wind rushed through narrow spaces, producing a whistling tone, it often meant stronger winds were on the way. When the wind moved softly, as though muffled, it meant moisture was thickening in the air. Even the sound of wind against rooftops or through reeds beside a river told farmers something about the sky. While we may not consciously analyze wind sounds today, many people still know the difference between a storm wind and a gentle wind simply by hearing it. That instinct, too, is ancient. Animals responded to wind in ways farmers understood. A sudden shift in wind direction often changed the behavior of birds, causing them to fly lower or retreat to sheltered places. Farm animals moved differently when wind patterns changed. Cows gathered closer. Sheep turned their bodies away from the incoming direction. Horses became alert. These observations helped farmers read the invisible. Today, when we see birds flying low or hear sudden quiet in nature, we often sense that weather is changing, even without knowing exactly why. But perhaps the most impressive aspect of wind reading was how farmers combined multiple clues. They never relied on just one sign. A warm wind from the west, combined with a reddish dawn and birds flying low, formed a pattern that nearly always meant rain. A cool wind with unusually clear morning air often signaled a calm, dry day. A wind that shifted direction repeatedly within a short span of time meant the atmosphere was unsettled, prompting farmers to prepare for anything, from sudden showers to unexpected gusts. This type of holistic thinking is something modern weather forecasts often replicate with advanced instruments. But early farmers did it purely through observation, memory, and instinct. They didn't separate the elements. They watched them together as part of a living system. The remarkable thing is that wind reading was not merely intellectual, it was emotional. Farmers developed a relationship with the wind, treating it almost like a companion. They trusted it. They understood its moods. They respected its unpredictability. The wind, to them, was not a force to be measured, but a voice to be interpreted. It guided them gently, day after day, season after season. Even today, we have echoes of this relationship. We still open windows to feel the air. We still notice when the wind feels wrong or strange. We still associate certain breezes with certain moods. And sometimes, when we step outside and sense a subtle change, perhaps a shift in temperature, a sudden gust, a particular scent, we know, deep inside, without needing an app or a forecast, that the weather is about to change. This instinctive understanding connects us to the people who stood centuries ago in fields at dawn, letting the wind speak to them. Their world moved more slowly, but their awareness ran deep. They learned to read a language that had no words yet conveyed everything they needed to know. And although technology has replaced their methods, the human senses they relied upon remain alive within us. Long before human beings ever imagined satellites drifting above the clouds, before charts and formulas and scientific terms entered our vocabulary, farmers looked upward and found an entire language written across the sky. Clouds were not simply decorations or drifting shapes. They were messengers carrying news from distant places. They formed, shifted, thinned, darkened, and dissolved in patterns that, to early farmers, seemed deliberate and meaningful. And though they lacked the instruments to measure pressure or humidity, they possessed something just as powerful: attention, a kind of deep, patient observation that allowed them to understand the sky with remarkable precision. They watched the clouds not casually, but intimately, reading them the way one reads the expressions of a familiar face. At dawn, farmers often studied the highest clouds first, the thin streaks far above. These delicate clouds, what we now call cirrus, didn't hamper sunlight, but filtered it slightly, creating soft halos or pale shimmers around the rising sun. To farmers, these clouds were gentle but important warnings. They meant winds high above the earth were moving moisture across the sky, often a sign that rain might come in the next day or two. Even without knowing the science, Farmers noticed that when these delicate horsehair clouds appeared, the weather tended to shift soon after. So they watched them with quiet respect, preparing themselves mentally for changes ahead. As the morning progressed, farmers turned their attention to clouds forming lower in the sky. These were often puffy, cotton-like shapes scattered across blue expanses. On peaceful days, they floated lazily, growing gently as the sun warmed the earth. Farmers recognized this as a sign of a calm and predictable day. When these clouds rose high and remained bright and soft, the weather stayed fair. But if their bases darkened or their edges sharpened, farmers sensed brewing tension. A cloud's shape, its edges, and even the speed with which it shifted could hint at storms forming from places far beyond their sight. There were moments when clouds seemed to rise upward rapidly, building towers of white that reached toward the sun. These tall, towering clouds, with bases growing darker, were warnings of instability. Farmers watched them carefully because they knew such clouds could develop into storms by afternoon. They had no language like cumulonimbus, yet their understanding was just as clear. A rising tower of cloud was not simply a spectacle. It was time to hurry certain tasks, secure tools, or bring animals closer to shelter. Their lives depended on the timing of such observations. On some days, clouds gathered low and heavy, forming a blanket that spread across the entire sky. The air beneath these clouds felt cooler, heavier. Farmers knew that these layers often brought steady, prolonged rain. They observed not only the sight of the clouds, but the atmosphere they created. When the world seemed muted, when distant sounds felt muffled, when the horizon blurred slightly, they felt the presence of moisture building in the sky. Today we occasionally notice this same sensation, how the world feels quieter before a gentle rain. This is not a modern intuition. It is an ancient memory carried through centuries of farmers who learned to interpret the sky not only through sight, but through sound and sensation. Cloud movement carried meaning too. Farmers observed how quickly clouds traveled. A sky filled with fast-moving clouds, even if they were thin, signaled disturbance above. If low clouds sped across the sky while higher ones drifted slowly in a different direction, farmers felt unease. They interpreted opposing cloud movements as signs of conflicting winds, which often led to unpredictable storms. Even today, when we look up and notice clouds moving in different directions, we feel a vague tension, sensing uneasily that the weather might shift. The instinct is ancient. Farmers also studied the spaces between clouds. A sky dotted with clouds but filled with light between them often meant stability. But a sky where clouds seemed to close in around one another, shrinking the patches of blue, typically meant moisture gathering and increasing likelihood of rain. The way shadows played across fields was another subtle indicator. When clouds produced long, slow-moving shadows, the weather remained calm. But when shadows flickered quickly across the land, farmers sensed that winds were changing direction or speed. These observations became part of a quiet, internal checklist farmers carried in their minds every time they walked outside. The color of the clouds mattered just as much as their shape. Bright white clouds reflected dry, stable air. But when clouds took on a dim, bluish-gray tone, farmers interpreted this as incoming rain. If the clouds darkened unevenly, lighter in some areas, heavier in others, it meant patchy weather, shifting winds, or storms that might come and go. A sky that turned a soft yellow before sunset often meant dust or dryness carried on distant winds. A sky tinted pink or red at dusk or dawn carried symbolism as old as farming itself. Red light at sunset often preceded clear weather the next day. Red light at sunrise often warned of rain later. We still speak these sayings aloud today, though most people no longer know the reasons behind them. They have survived because generations of observers confirmed them long before scientific explanations existed. Farmers also paid attention to clouds that formed over specific landmarks. A lone cloud hovering consistently above a hill or mountain was more than a scenic view. It indicated how moisture gathered and moved through the area. Some hills created their own cloud patterns due to rising air, and farmers who lived nearby learned to use these local behaviors as indicators. A cloud that clung to a hill in the morning and dissolved by midday often meant calm weather. But a cloud that thickened or descended slowly along the slopes meant increased humidity and the possibility of showers. This type of hyperlocal reading is nearly forgotten today, Yet some rural communities still know the signs, inherited like family stories. Sometimes clouds brought silence before change. On unusually calm days, clouds seemed to freeze in place, barely shifting. Farmers recognized this peculiar stillness as a sign that the atmosphere was gathering energy. When clouds paused like this during warm seasons, storms often followed. In cooler seasons, such stillness could mean coming frost. This stillness is something many modern people still notice without realizing its meaning. The eerie quiet before the sky opens. One of the most subtle skills farmers developed was reading the thickness of the cloud layers. Thin layers that allowed filtered sunlight through suggested light, non-threatening moisture. But thick layers that blocked even the brightest sun meant heavy rain was likely. They learned to distinguish between layers stacked on top of each other and single, dense blankets. A stacked sky, with several soft, hazy layers of cloud, usually brought drizzle or fog. A single heavy layer brought downpours. But farmers didn't just read clouds as distant shapes. They read how clouds made them feel. They noticed when the air beneath them grew cooler or when humidity pressed against their skin. They paid attention to how the light dimmed or brightened, how shadows softened or sharpened. Their bodies became instruments, just as sensitive, sometimes more so, than the tools we rely on today. There were moments when farmers stepped outside, took a single breath, and knew instinctively what would unfold. The scents carried in the air, the texture of moisture on the skin, the thickness of sunlight. All these sensations created a kind of quiet certainty. Another piece of cloud wisdom came from watching how clouds formed throughout the day. Clouds appearing suddenly around midday often meant that warm air was rising and gathering moisture. If these clouds thickened and darkened, storms could form by afternoon. But if the clouds dissolved gently as evening approached, the next day often promised calm skies. This daily pattern became a rhythm for farmers, a cycle they trusted. Their entire schedule, when to sow seeds, when to harvest, when to mend fences, when to bring livestock close, depended on reading these subtle signs. Perhaps the most profound skill farmers possessed was the ability to connect their observations with memory. Clouds were not isolated events. They were part of a larger narrative shaped by seasons, past years, local geography, and long-term patterns. Farmers compared today's clouds with clouds from last week, last month, last year. They remembered which cloud formations preceded good harvests and which preceded hardship. They carried these memories not in books, but in lived experience, handed down from parent to child, shared quietly among neighbors. What makes this ancient knowledge remarkable is how much of it remains inside us, unnoticed. Even now, many people feel uneasy beneath a sky that darkens quickly. Many people sense coming rain when clouds thicken unevenly. Many people describe the sky as threatening or hopeful, language inherited from ancestors who understood the emotional language of clouds. We may not stand in fields at dawn or spend hours watching the horizon, but the instincts they honed have not vanished. They linger in our perception, in our conversations, and in the quiet feeling we get when we look up and sense something changing. Before instruments existed, before even the earliest attempts at scientific forecasting took shape, farmers relied deeply on something we often overlook today, the living world around them. They trusted the land, the animals, the plants, and even the smallest movements of nature to reveal what the sky would do next. Their world was not divided between people and nature. Everything was woven into one continuous conversation. And weather, unpredictable, powerful, essential weather, was spoken about in that shared language. Today, we might step outside and glance upward, relying mostly on the clouds or the air itself. But for those who lived centuries ago, the signs hidden in the living world were just as important as anything seen in the sky. Every branch, every leaf, every bird, and every breeze carried meaning, a message encoded in movement, sound, scent, or stillness. People learned to read these messages with a sensitivity that seems almost impossible today unless one imagines a quiet world with no phones, no clocks, and no distractions. Only open land, open sky, and open attention. The first teachers of weather were not clouds or wind, but animals. Farmers quickly learned that animals behaved differently when weather was about to shift. Birds were among the clearest indicators. If swallows flew low over fields in calm weather, farmers sensed moisture in the air. without understanding the science, that insects fly lower when humidity increases and birds follow them. They simply saw the pattern repeated countless times. When birds soared high and seemed relaxed, the air held little moisture and storms were unlikely. But on mornings when birds remained close to the ground, flapping with heavier effort, farmers took this as a quiet warning. The sky was preparing rain. Even today, when we see birds flying unusually low, many of us feel the familiar sense that rain is near, though we may not consciously understand why. This instinct belongs to ancient generations who spent their lives watching the natural world with careful eyes. Farmers also watched how birds perched. Before storms, birds often gathered together on low branches, refusing to fly far. Some species became unusually silent, creating a strange hush that farmers recognized as a sign of pressure changes. If birds disappeared entirely from open fields and sought the shelter of hedges and thickets, farmers prepared for winds. The silence of birds was not just absence. It carried meaning, like a held breath before something important. Even now, many people remark on the eerie quiet before storms, an instinct passed down through centuries of observation. Larger animals gave different kinds of warnings. Cows, for example, often laid down in herds before rain. Farmers noticed this early, long before explanations were proposed. The same behavior appeared among sheep, who huddled more tightly when the air thickened with moisture. Horses became restless before changes in air pressure, walking in small circles or tossing their heads. Farmers recognized these patterns not because they studied animals scientifically, but because they spent every day among them. They understood the unspoken language of animals that sensed changes humans could not detect directly. Even insects played a vital role in weather prediction. Before rain, ants often retreated deeper into their hills, closing openings or building small mounds that protected their tunnels. When farmers saw ant hills growing taller or more covered, they sensed storms approaching. Bees also behaved differently. On calm days, bees traveled far, but when weather was unstable, they stayed close to their hives, flying in shorter, more hesitant patterns. Farmers knew that bee activity was one of the most reliable signs of approaching rain or storms. Some even kept hives specifically because bees were such skilled weather readers. The land itself carried messages too. Farmers sensed upcoming weather through the scent of the earth, through the way the ground responded to humidity, and through how distant hills and fields appeared. Before rain, the soil often released a deep, earthy smell as moisture rose from below. Farmers walking across their fields felt the change beneath their feet. The ground became softer, more pliant, more alive with scent. Today, we still notice the smell of rain before it arrives, though many do not know the deep history behind that recognition. Long before the term petrichor was invented, farmers understood its meaning intuitively. Rain was coming. Plants reacted to weather in equally subtle ways. Leaves often curled inward before storms, protecting themselves from heavy raindrops. Some flowers closed hours before clouds even appeared. Farmers watched how petals folded or how stems bowed slightly toward the earth. Clover leaves, in particular, were known to rise or fall depending on moisture levels. Even low grasses shifted their posture when storms approached, bending more sharply or lying flatter against the ground. To a casual observer, these changes were barely noticeable. But to farmers who observed the same plants every day for decades, they were clear, reliable messages about the coming sky. Trees carried their own signals. The sound of wind moving through trees varied with incoming weather. Before storms, the leaves often produced a deeper, more hollow rustling sound. The dryness or moistness of the bark, the way branches responded to pressure, even the scent released from certain trees could hint at changes. Pine trees became especially fragrant before rain, releasing resins that filled the air with a sharp, clean smell. Farmers learned to trust their noses as much as their eyes. The behavior of water offered clues as well. Lakes and ponds often grew still before storms, as if holding their breath. Ripples moved differently, more erratically, when winds were shifting. Streams bubbled more loudly or softly, depending on humidity changes. Farmers who lived near water learned to read these signs instinctively. Even the color of water could change. Before storms, water appeared slightly darker, reflecting the sky's tension even before clouds thickened. In open fields, farmers watched how dust moved. Dust rising easily into the air meant dry weather. Dust that hovered close to the ground or refused to lift at all meant moisture levels were rising. When farmers walked across dry soil and saw dust clinging to their boots rather than blowing away, they interpreted it as a sign of impending rain. The land was preparing, absorbing moisture invisibly long before droplets fell from the sky. Air movement provided even more subtle clues. Before storms, the air often felt heavy, pressing gently against the skin. Farmers felt this weight, not as discomfort, but as a change in atmosphere that meant something was approaching. The breeze could shift direction unpredictably or pause entirely. This stillness, the sudden, unnatural quiet of wind, was one of the strongest indicators of storms. Even today, many of us sense when the air becomes strangely still, carrying a silent tension that precedes rainfall or thunder. One of the most overlooked but reliable signs involved sound. Before storms, distant noises often traveled further because moisture in the air carried sound waves more efficiently. Farmers noticed that their own footsteps sounded different. Voices carried further across fields. The distant clanging of a metal tool or the barking of a dog felt unusually sharp or close. This altered sound landscape told farmers that the atmosphere was thickening with moisture, a sign that rain or storms were near. Even today, we sometimes notice that the world sounds different before rain, though we may not recognize it as a weather sign. In all these observations, what stands out most is the depth of connection farmers had with the natural world. Their survival depended on noticing not just one sign, but dozens of signs working together. Birds flying low, animals growing restless, leaves curling, air growing heavy, scents changing, water darkening, sounds carrying differently. They read these signs like pages in a familiar book, interpreting each detail in relation to the others. Nothing stood alone. Everything formed a complete picture. What is remarkable is how much of this ancient awareness survives inside us today, hidden beneath modern distractions. We may not watch animals closely or pay attention to the behavior of insects, but somewhere within us, the instinct remains. When birds fall silent, some part of us grows uneasy. When the air becomes heavy, we pause without thinking. When leaves turn strangely or flowers close unexpectedly, we sense that change is coming. When the world grows too quiet, when scents grow stronger, when water appears darker, something in our mind whispers a reminder of the old ways. Weather is shifting. Today, few people rely on these signs for survival, yet they remain powerful clues for anyone willing to slow down and observe. The ancient farmers who depended on these signs lived with a heightened awareness that modern life rarely encourages. But their knowledge, deep, patient, intuitive, still flows through our senses in smaller, quieter forms. Long before the invention of thermometers or humidity gauges, long before anyone wrote down formulas or created instruments to measure the atmosphere, farmers relied on something far more intimate and immediate: the air itself. Not the sky, not the clouds, not the wind alone, but the direct, palpable sensation of the air touching their skin, pressing lightly against their clothing, chilling their hands, or warming their breath. They knew that air could change long before the sky revealed anything dramatic. A slight thickness against the face, a sudden dryness in the throat, a shift in warmth that felt wrong for the season. These sensations became the earliest barometers. The air carried clues that only patient, attentive people could sense. And so, each day, farmers stepped outside, paused, breathed deeply, and let the atmosphere speak to them. They paid attention to temperature differences that modern minds often dismiss. If a morning felt unusually warm after a cool night, farmers sensed that moisture was rising from the ground and condensing in the air. This meant rain was likely later in the day, even if the sky appeared harmless. If the air felt crisp and unusually cold before sunrise, the farmers knew that the land had cooled too quickly during the night, a sign that the day would remain chilly and possibly windy. They had no numerical measurement for these changes, no degrees or statistics, yet they noticed patterns that repeated year after year. One of the most powerful tools farmers possessed was their sensitivity to humidity. Moisture in the air changed everything. The way it felt on the skin, the way smells carried, even the way sounds traveled. Farmers didn't need scientific terms to describe humidity. They felt it in the weight of their clothing, in how easily their tools became slippery, and how much effort it took to breathe after several hours outdoors. Humidity made the air feel thicker, more enveloping, like a soft blanket drawn around the shoulders. Before storms, this thickening became unmistakable. The air grew heavy, pressing against the skin, making every movement feel slightly more resistant. Farmers recognized this heaviness as a sign of incoming rain or thunderstorms, long before clouds announced anything visually. They also sensed humidity through their surroundings. Doors and wooden fences swelled slightly when the moisture rose, becoming harder to close or heavier to move. Rope fibers tightened or softened depending on the amount of water in the air. Leather straps stretched more easily. Farmers noticed these tiny details because their daily routines involved constant contact with natural materials. A gate that refused to latch easily meant something in the atmosphere had changed. A tool handle that felt tacky or unusually smooth was another subtle clue. Even the earth itself spoke through humidity. Soil became softer, more fragrant, and darker in color long before rain touched it. All of these signs formed a quiet chorus farmers listened to carefully. Then there was the stillness, one of the most reliable signs of changing weather. Before storms, the world often fell strangely silent. Birds quieted, insects ceased their buzzing, and even the breeze seemed to pause. Farmers understood this silence immediately. The air felt suffocating, still, almost suspended. Even those with little experience sensed something unsettling in such moments, a natural tension that the world was holding itself in place. This eerie calm, often described as the air waiting, meant the atmosphere was shifting rapidly. Even without clouds or wind, the stillness alone could warn farmers that something was coming. Today, many people still feel uneasy when the world grows silent before a storm. The instinct is ancient, carried through generations of people who once depended on this signal to prepare their fields and protect their homes. Another powerful tool was breath. Farmers could literally feel weather changes through their breathing. Before rain, the air tasted slightly metallic or earthy. Before cold fronts, the air felt sharper in the chest. Before storms, the air gained a certain fullness, as if each breath was heavier. These sensations were so familiar to farmers that they rarely thought of them as predictions. They were simply part of living close to the land. When they inhaled deeply in the early morning and felt a slight constraint in their lungs, they knew humidity was rising. When they exhaled and saw their breath linger in the cold longer than usual, they sensed frost coming. Their bodies were instruments far more attuned to change than any device they could imagine. Farmers also used the feel of air movement to understand weather patterns. Even when breezes were too light to be seen in the movement of trees, they could feel them on their faces or hands. A warm breeze in cool seasons often signaled moisture. A cool breeze in warm seasons hinted at stability. Sudden shifts in these patterns meant weather was on the way. They interpreted the wind's texture, not just its direction. Some air felt smooth, gliding across the skin like silk, indicating calm weather. Other air felt rough, pushing unevenly, suggesting turbulence. These textures were real, not poetic, but physical sensations that farmers trusted. Temperature changes were often more important than visual signs. Farmers noticed that when temperatures rose quickly in the early morning, storms frequently followed. When temperatures dropped gradually throughout the day, nighttime frost was likely. They predicted entire weather cycles through these temperature patterns. Today, we rarely pay attention to such subtle shifts because we rely on numbers displayed on screens. But ancient farmers felt temperature the way musicians feel rhythm, intuitively, constantly, without needing to quantify it. Moisture could also be sensed through subtle physical changes in the body. Farmers felt their joints stiffen slightly before humidity rose, a phenomenon still familiar to many people today. They felt their hair respond differently. Even their clothing behaved differently depending on the air. Fabrics became heavier when moisture levels increased. Wool absorbed humidity and felt warmer against the skin. Linen became cooler during drying weather. These changes, so faint most modern people never noticed them, were meaningful clues in the days before instruments existed. The scent of the air offered some of the clearest hints. Before rain, the world smelled rich, earthy, alive. Before storms, there was a faint electric smell, what we now know as ozone, that farmers recognized instinctively. Before frost, the air carried a sharp, almost sweet smell as moisture froze. These scents were part of daily life. Farmers didn't treat them as mysteries. They were as familiar as the scent of bread or soil. Even today, we sometimes smell the coming rain long before any drop falls, but now we treat it as a pleasant curiosity rather than a message from the land. Another key observation involved evaporation. Farmers often sprinkled small amounts of water onto stones or soil to see how quickly it evaporated. Fast evaporation meant dry air and stable weather. Slow evaporation meant humidity rising and possible storms. This simple test, repeated thousands of times over centuries, became one of the most reliable techniques for predicting short-term changes. It required no instruments, only patience and understanding of patterns. They also paid attention to dew. A heavy layer of dew in the morning usually meant clear skies the night before and likely clear skies ahead. Lack of dew often meant clouds overnight or moisture building invisibly. Dew was one of nature's quietest messengers, forming silently, gently, and predictably. Farmers checked it daily without fail, using it to guide decisions about planting, harvesting, and drying crops. Even today, gardeners sometimes rely on dew patterns, though few know the ancient logic behind them. The texture of the air around sunset was another clue. Warm, lingering air after sunset suggested stable high pressure and calm weather. Rapid cooling meant dry, clear conditions. But when the air remained oddly warm or seemed to hold heat unnaturally, farmers sensed incoming storms or humidity brought by distant weather systems. This post-sunset air check became routine across countless generations. One of the most extraordinary aspects of early weather prediction was how farmers combined all these senses. They didn't rely on a single sign. They watched, felt, smelled, listened. They interpreted the land as if it were alive, and in many ways, it was. Animal behavior, plant movement, soil texture, air temperature, humidity, scent, stillness, each was one note in a much larger song. Farmers learned to recognize the patterns formed when these notes came together. They didn't need scientific vocabulary, they needed only patience and memory. Even more remarkable is how much of this knowledge still sleeps inside us. Though we rarely use it, our bodies remember. Many people feel uneasy before storms. Many sense a chill coming even before temperatures drop. Many smell rain before clouds gather. Many detect shifts in humidity by the way the air touches their skin. We are not separate from our ancestors in this regard. We are simply distracted from noticing what they noticed. The ancient farmers listened to the world not because they were superstitious or primitive, but because the world spoke clearly to those willing to pause. The feel of the air was their most honest guide, a quiet voice whispering what tomorrow might bring. Long before instruments existed, farmers understood that the horizon, distant hills, fields, forests, rivers, and even the thin lines separating sky from land, held some of the clearest and earliest signs of coming weather. To modern eyes, the horizon is simply scenery, a background that frames the world. But to ancient farmers, it functioned almost like a living weather screen. They watched how far they could see, how clearly shapes appeared, how sharply or softly the edges of hills stood out, and how light traveled from one ridge to the next. These observations, subtle and gentle, helped them understand what the sky was preparing long before clouds darkened or winds shifted. This chapter explores how people learned to listen to the horizon, not with machines or numbers, but with patient eyes and quiet intuition. Each morning, farmers would step outside and gaze toward the furthest point visible from their land. The clarity of distant objects mattered deeply. When distant hills stood crisp and sharp, their outlines clean against the sky, it meant the air was dry and clear. Even if clouds were present, sharp horizons signaled stability. Dry air allowed light to travel cleanly, revealing every ridge and every tree. But on days when the distant hills seemed faint, as if washed with a pale film, farmers knew moisture was building in the lower atmosphere. The sky did not need to be gray. Even a blue sky could hide moisture thick enough to blur the horizon. Today, people occasionally notice this too. Distant mountains or tall buildings appear softer before rain, but they no longer treat it as a warning. To early farmers, however, this fading horizon meant one thing: prepare for incoming moisture, whether it arrived as fog, drizzle, or full storms. The horizon also changed color long before the sky above did. Farmers learned to read these color shifts with extraordinary sensitivity. A bluish tint meant stable weather. A yellow or brown tint indicated dust or dryness carried by distant winds. A greenish tint, subtle and rare, suggested heavy moisture, what we today associate with storms. The most telling was a dim white haze creeping upward from the distant ground, almost like breath fogging a mirror. This haze formed when humidity rose close to the Earth's surface, often a day before noticeable cloud cover. Farmers read this faint whiteness as an early signal of thickening air, a sign to delay tasks requiring dryness, like drying grains or harvesting herbs. Light was another crucial messenger. Farmers noticed how sunlight behaved at great distances. If early morning light traveled smoothly across fields, illuminating distant trees and stones evenly, the day would likely be calm. But if the light shimmered, producing a trembling effect on faraway objects, farmers sensed unstable air currents. This shimmering, caused by uneven pockets of warm and cool air, often preceded storms or sudden temperature changes. Even today, when people drive on hot roads and see heat waves bending the distant pavement into a mirage, they are witnessing this same atmospheric trembling. Ancient farmers simply noticed it sooner and understood its implications. Shadows behaved differently on days when weather was shifting. On clear, stable mornings, shadows fell sharply, well-defined and dark. Every stone, fence, and leaf cast a crisp outline. But when the atmosphere held moisture, even before clouds appeared, shadows softened. They lost contrast. They appeared faint, almost diluted. This subtle dimming told farmers that sunlight was passing through moist air, a sign that the sky would later thicken. Farmers often stepped outside early just to study their own shadow. If it appeared weak or blurry, they adjusted their plans accordingly. A whole day's work rhythm could shift based on the softness of one shadow. The horizon also served as a canvas for air clarity. Farmers paid close attention to how far sound traveled. Although sound is invisible, its reach over distance revealed much about the atmosphere. On calm, dry days, voices carried far across fields, bouncing clearly off valleys and slopes. But on days when the horizon blurred, sound changed character. It traveled farther, but with softer edges. Distant noises seemed closer, yet less crisp. Farmers recognized this as a sign of rising humidity. Sound waves traveled through moisture more efficiently, but with reduced clarity. This connection between sound and horizon might seem obscure now, but for those who lived side by side with the land, it was as natural as breathing. Another powerful clue lay in the movement of birds across the horizon. Migratory birds often flew low when storms approached, their silhouettes darkening the distant sky in slow, even patterns. Birds that normally soared high descended closer to the landscape, drawn downward by changes in atmospheric pressure. Farmers who saw flocks flying lower than usual knew the pressure was dropping, even if they didn't have the vocabulary to describe it. The horizon crowded with low-flying birds signaled incoming rain or wind. If birds flew unusually high, disappearing quickly into the distance, it often meant a long stretch of calm weather ahead. Light reflecting off water near the horizon offered yet another form of guidance. Lakes and rivers reflected sunlight differently depending on humidity. When the air was dry, the water sparkled clearly, sending distinct points of light toward the far shore. But when humidity rose, reflections grew duller, spreading softly like brushed metal rather than dancing like glitter. These subtle differences, barely noticeable to untrained eyes, communicated powerful information to ancient farmers. Water, and the way light touched it, was among the most reliable indicators of shifting skies. The movement of dust near the horizon also revealed impending weather. When wagons or herds stirred up dust that lingered in the air, hanging low instead of floating upward, moisture was present. Dust that rose quickly and dispersed meant dry conditions. Farmers observed not only dust itself, but how it moved in relation to light. A halo-like effect, dust illuminated softly by sunlight, often appeared before storms, a visual cue that air was thickening with invisible particles. This halo was not dramatic. It merely softened the boundary between earth and sky. Farmers trusted this sign deeply. At times, even the clarity of stars influenced horizon reading. The horizon at dawn reflected the quality of the night sky before it. When stars appeared unusually bright and crisp the night before, Farmers expected a dry morning and likely a dry day. When stars looked hazier or dimmer despite a clear sky, they took this as a sign of moisture gathering invisibly near the Earth's surface. The transition between star clarity and horizon softness was one of the most silent but powerful indicators of weather ahead. Another remarkable tool was the appearance of distant fires. Farmers often saw smoke rising from chimneys across the horizon. Smoke rising straight and tall meant stable conditions. Smoke bending sideways or dispersing unusually fast meant shifting winds. But the most telling sign was when smoke moved in multiple directions at once, rising, then flattening, then swirling. Such movement revealed conflicting air currents, almost always preceding weather changes. Even the color of smoke changed with humidity. Dry air made smoke brighter, moist air darkened it. These changes at the horizon were warnings that farmers relied upon without needing explanation. Horizon reading also taught farmers to observe contrasts. When the boundary between land and sky grew sharp, almost cutting, the atmosphere was clear and stable. But when land seemed to fade gently into the sky, blending softly like watercolor, atmospheric moisture was building. Today, painters often try to replicate this soft blending effect in art, but ancient farmers saw it as nature's warning. They learned that a faded horizon meant rain within a day or two. Even the shape of the horizon could change depending on temperature layers. Warm air rising above cool air sometimes caused distant hills to appear taller or slightly distorted, as though bending or swelling. This effect, now known as refraction, was familiar to ancient observers. They interpreted these distortions as signs of unusual air layering, which often brought unstable weather. When the horizon shimmered or appeared uneven, farmers sensed that the sky was preparing something unpredictable. Distant forests also contributed clues. On dry days, farmers saw every line and shade in far-off trees. But when moisture filled the air, the forests darkened as a whole, appearing less detailed. The leaves lost their individual brilliance, blending into uniform patches of color. This visual softening, like the fading hills, indicated moisture gathering. One of the most fascinating aspects of horizon reading was how farmers connected multiple signs without writing anything down. They knew that a soft horizon combined with still air meant heavy rain. They knew that a sharp horizon combined with shimmering light meant unstable heat. They knew that haze creeping upward meant storms in a day or two. They knew that flickering shadows meant fast-moving air layers. These patterns were not learned from textbooks, but from life itself, through decades of mornings, evenings, seasons, failures, and successes. The horizon was their scoreboard, their calendar, their guide. It told them when to plant, when to harvest, when to cover stored food, when to lead animals to higher ground, when to stay close to home. It was not mystical, it was observational science practiced without scientific language. What makes this ancient skill remarkable is how much of it still lives within us, even if dormant. We notice when distant objects blur. We sense when the world feels too quiet. We see haze rising even when we don't consciously analyze it. We notice how sunsets look different before storms. We observe how light changes. We feel something in our bones when the horizon dims strangely. These instincts are not gone. They are simply quiet. They were once the difference between survival and hardship, and though we no longer depend on them, the world continues to whisper through the horizon, inviting anyone who pauses long enough to listen. For ancient farmers, the horizon was not far away at all. It was the closest guide they had, stretching out before them like a page of unwritten wisdom, waiting to be read each day. Long before paper calendars, before printed almanacs, before even the earliest scientific attempts to measure temperature or track rainfall, farmers lived inside the rhythm of the seasons in a way we can hardly imagine today. To them, the year was not divided by dates or numbers, but by sensations, patterns, and subtle transitions. The world itself, its colors, temperatures, winds, and creatures, formed a continuous lesson plan that repeated year after year. And through careful observation, generations of farmers learned to predict not just tomorrow's weather, but the entire character of an upcoming season. They didn't think of their knowledge as forecasting. It was simply the way they lived, listening to the earth as one might listen to a familiar teacher whose lessons deepened each year. Every season began long before it officially arrived. Farmers recognized the earliest hints of change in places modern people rarely look. The first whisper of spring, for example, was not the sudden warmth or the blooming of flowers, but a particular softness in the air. Winter air was sharp, brittle, almost metallic in its clarity. But as the season shifted, even when temperatures remained low, the air began to move differently. Farmers felt a hint of looseness in the wind, a slight dampness that suggested melting beneath the soil, a subtle stretching of daylight that warmed the eyes even before it warmed the skin. These tiny changes became the foundation for predicting the type of spring ahead, whether it would come early, whether it would be wet, whether frost might linger longer than usual. Animals were the earliest heralds of seasonal change. Birds adjusted their songs, their movements, and their presence weeks before weather changed significantly. Farmers noticed which birds returned first, which ones remained strangely absent, and how high or low they flew. A particularly delayed arrival of certain migratory birds could suggest a colder spring. A sudden burst of bird activity could hint at warming air even if frost still clung to the fields. These signs were not rigid rules, but patterns familiar enough to guide decisions about planting, storing food, and preparing tools. Plants also sent subtle messages about the coming season. The first buds on certain shrubs, the timing of sap rising in trees, the speed at which moss grew across stones. These details, seemingly too small to matter, became deeply meaningful to farmers. When buds swelled early but hesitated to open, farmers suspected unstable weather ahead. When sap rose quickly and consistently in maple or birch trees, they expected a smooth transition into spring. Moss growing more thickly on the north side of stones or trees sometimes signaled increased humidity for the coming months. Farmers built entire seasonal predictions from these clues, understanding that nature rarely changed at random. The soil itself was among the greatest seasonal teachers. When winter began to loosen its grip, farmers knelt down and touched the earth. They squeezed it, crumbled it, smelled it. A soil that remained cold and dense beneath the surface meant the deeper frost had not yet lifted, delaying planting. Soil that warmed quickly near the top suggested early growth ahead. The scent of the soil mattered too. A sweet, earthy smell indicated healthy moisture and readiness for seeds. A flat, muted smell meant too much lingering cold, requiring more patience. These sensory observations replaced any need for instruments. Farmers simply learned to read what the earth revealed each day. As spring turned to summer, new lessons emerged. The earliest summer winds carried clues about the strength of the coming heat. Farmers sensed whether the air felt lazy and slow or energetic and restless. A slow, heavy warmth early in the season often meant long, stable heat ahead. But a restless wind, warm yet inconsistent, sometimes indicated storms or droughts. The sky's color in late afternoon became a reliable hint. A clear, brilliant blue predicted long stretches of warm days, while a slightly pale or washed-out blue signaled humidity rising, increasing the likelihood of rain cycles. In summer, farmers watched trees more closely than clouds. Leaves that curled slightly at the edges suggested dryness creeping upward from the roots. Leaves that remained flat and open indicated sufficient moisture. Farmers listened to the sound of wind moving through the leaves. A deep, full rustling sound meant healthy, hydrated foliage. A dry, papery rustle meant heat would intensify in the coming days. This leaf language allowed farmers to prepare for drought, choosing when to water crops more carefully or when to begin preserving foods early. Perhaps one of the most fascinating forms of long-term prediction came from the behavior of insects and ground-level creatures. When ants built taller hills than usual or reinforced the tops of their mounds early in the season, farmers expected heavy rainfall later in the year. When crickets began chirping more slowly as summer approached, it sometimes meant cooler nights would arrive sooner than normal. Even spiders provided weather cues. Webs built lower to the ground often indicated stable weather, while webs built high suggested incoming winds or storms. Farmers observed these signs not with the curiosity of scientists, but with the familiarity of people whose survival was intertwined with nature's rhythm. As summer neared its end, farmers started reading signs that hinted at autumn. The earliest signal was often temperature consistency. If nights cooled down gently and predictably, autumn would be calm. If nights remained warm unexpectedly, or if morning fog grew thicker than usual, farmers prepared for a wetter season. Fog was a powerful messenger. Thin, lifting fog meant good harvest conditions. Thick, persistent fog hinted at moisture that would complicate drying crops or storing grains. Farmers walked through fog with a sense of listening. They watched how it clung to grass, how it drifted across fields, how quickly it dissolved as the sun rose. The sound of the land shifted too. Crickets changed their tone, birds quieted earlier in the evening, and even the movement of farm animals grew slower or more cautious. These shifts were not simply part of nature's beauty, they were messages. Farmers interpreted them as cues that the year's final harvests needed to be timed carefully. Some years, when animals acted restlessly, farmers sensed storms approaching early in autumn. Other years, when evenings were silent and peaceful, they prepared for a gradual seasonal decline. Autumn's approach also revealed itself through moisture. Dew formed heavier on chilly mornings. Leaves refused to dry quickly even when the sun rose high. Soil retained water longer. Farmers checked the weight of morning air by simply stepping outside and breathing deeply. If the air felt thin and brittle, frost would arrive soon. If it felt thick and wet, rain cycles would dominate the coming weeks. This simple act of breathing became a weather tool, just as important as observing clouds or wind. When autumn fully arrived, farmers focused on how leaves changed color. The timing and intensity of these colors held clues about winter. A sudden, intense burst of color meant the trees were drawing moisture inward quickly, preparing for a harsh winter. A slow, gradual shift suggested a milder one. The speed of leaf drop mattered, too. If leaves fell early and cleanly, winter would be firm but predictable. If leaves clung stubbornly to branches, dropping irregularly, it sometimes meant wild temperature swings ahead. These were not superstitions. They were patterns seen across countless generations of observations. Winter signs, too, emerged long before snow fell. The behavior of birds, especially those that stayed year-round, became hugely important. Birds fluffing their feathers more often, gathering nearer to warm areas, or moving restlessly at dusk were early signals of incoming cold snaps. The movement of clouds on winter mornings held meaning as well. Thin, high clouds on cold days predicted stable weather. Low, fast-moving clouds signaled storms. Even the sound of snow underfoot carried information. Dry, squeaking snow meant temperatures were extremely low, and stable conditions would continue. Wet, soft snow left early clues about thaw cycles or incoming warm fronts. Perhaps the most impressive long-term prediction method involved observing how animals behaved weeks before winter officially arrived. Farmers paid attention to how deeply animals burrowed, how much fat certain species built, how high birds nested, and even how squirrels stored their nuts. These behaviors revealed more about the upcoming winter than any modern guesswork without instruments. If animals behaved as though the winter would be harsh, building deeper nests, gathering more food, showing greater urgency, farmers trusted those signs above all else. All these observations were not isolated facts, but part of a living system farmers read constantly. The year unfolded like a long, unbroken story. Each season left clues for the next. Farmers did not seek to control nature or predict it with perfect accuracy. They sought to live in rhythm with it. Their understanding of long-term weather patterns came from seeing the world as a unified whole rather than as a series of separate pieces. Clouds, animals, plants, soil, winds, horizon, they were all parts of one conversation. What makes this ancient knowledge most remarkable is how deeply it shaped human intuition. Even in today's world, with precise forecasts available instantly, people still feel certain seasonal instincts. We sense when winter will be harsh. We notice when spring arrives early, even before trees bloom. We feel when summer will be dry or wet. These instincts are remnants of the ancient relationship farmers had with the land. They learned by living inside nature's lessons, not by measuring them. And their wisdom did not fade. It simply became quieter as the world grew louder. But if we slow down, breathe deeply, and pay attention to the same subtle signs they once watched with such care, we can still feel the truth of the seasons whispering through the world around us. For ancient farmers, dawn and dusk were not simply the bookends of a day. They were windows into the hidden workings of the atmosphere, delicate moments when the sky revealed truths that remained invisible during the bright hours in between. These daily transitions, when night surrendered to day or day surrendered to night, offered a natural laboratory for observation. The colors, the light, the intensity of the glow across the land, the shapes of shadows, the way mist formed or dissolved, the clarity of the horizon, and even the emotional tone of the sky became clues that guided decisions far more important than we might imagine today. To modern eyes, dawn and dusk may look peaceful or beautiful. To ancient farmers, they were among the most powerful forecasting tools available. And because they observed these transitions every single day, year after year, the depth of their knowledge grew into something almost instinctive, a quiet ability to feel what the sky was preparing simply by watching how the light behaved. At dawn, the very first color appearing on the horizon was meaningful. When farmers saw soft pink or gentle gold spreading evenly, they sensed stability. These colors meant dry air, steady winds, and calm skies. But when dawn arrived with a reddish glow, a deep, warm red stretching across the horizon, it often warned of moisture in the atmosphere. Farmers learned early that reddish dawns meant incoming rain or storms later in the day, even when the sky above looked clear. This simple idea survived centuries and still lives in the old saying, "Red sky in morning, shepherd's warning." Yet, even without such a phrase, ancient farmers understood the logic. Red light at dawn meant sunlight was passing through moisture in the air to the east, a sign that weather systems were shifting. Dusk carried its own meaning. A deep red sky at sunset was almost always a sign of good weather the next day, because the light was passing through dry air in the west, where weather systems usually approached from. Ancient farmers didn't know anything about weather systems or atmospheric pressure, but they didn't need to. They simply watched, remembered, and trusted the patterns. When they saw a golden or reddish glow stretching far across the western horizon at dusk, they relaxed, knowing the night would be calm and the next day likely clear. But the sky offered far more than color. The glow itself, its intensity, its duration, its softness, told farmers what the atmosphere planned next. A strong, long-lasting glow after sunset meant stable air and fair conditions. A weak, quickly fading glow meant moisture thickening in the atmosphere. Farmers noticed that when the evening glow lingered longer than usual, stretching gently into twilight, the following morning arrived with clarity and calm. Light that vanished abruptly signaled instability, like the sky refusing to hold on to its final colors. Dawn mist became another powerful indicator. If mist formed thickly in valleys but slowly lifted as sunlight warmed the land, farmers trusted the day ahead. This meant the atmosphere was calm, moisture was low, and the sun's rising heat worked predictably. But mist that refused to lift, lingering stubbornly long after sunrise, suggested moisture saturation. Farmers interpreted this as a sign that rain was likely throughout the day. Even today, we sometimes notice fog behaving strangely, either rising gracefully or settling heavily. Ancient farmers learned to read this behavior with remarkable accuracy. When the sun first touched the land, shadows offered their own clues. Strong, sharply defined shadows at dawn meant clear air. Soft or blurred shadows meant moisture. The way shadows stretched across fields, their crispness, their speed of movement, the way they interacted with morning light, told farmers how stable the air was. When shadows flickered or danced due to atmospheric movement, farmers prepared for unpredictable weather. When shadows appeared steady and elongated gracefully, they approached the day with confidence. The shape and color of clouds during dawn and dusk were especially important. Farmers watched not only what the clouds looked like, but how they changed as the light moved across them. Clouds lit from beneath by the rising or setting sun often revealed hidden layers of moisture. Pale orange clouds floating gently meant fair weather. Bright red clouds stacked in layers meant a mass of moisture gathering. Dark gray streaks at dawn could indicate incoming storms, while pink-tinged clouds drifting lazily at dusk promised calm days ahead. Farmers also observed how clouds dissolved or formed during these transitions. If clouds dissolved quickly as the sun rose, the air was dry and stable. If clouds thickened as daylight approached, moisture was rising and weather shifts were likely. At sunset, clouds that held their shape meant stable weather. Clouds that expanded or stretched rapidly meant shifting atmospheric pressure. Even the direction of light mattered. Farmers noticed when dawn light appeared unusually far north or south on the horizon, signaling seasonal transitions. The earliest farmers likely didn't understand the tilt of the earth or the mechanics of seasons, but they knew that the position of the sun held meaning. Dawn slightly further north meant the warmth of spring approaching. Dawn moving south meant winter tightening its grip. This positional reading of the sun helped farmers understand long-term weather patterns without any instruments at all. Another fascinating sign came from how the land itself reacted to dawn light. Farmers observed that on mornings before storms, the land appeared strangely muted. Even when sunlight touched the fields, the brightness seemed weak, filtered through invisible moisture. The sky wasn't necessarily cloudy, but the light lacked clarity. On calm days, the first sunlight awakened the land brightly, illuminating every blade of grass and every stone. When that brightness failed to materialize, farmers sensed trouble. The same applied to dusk. When the last rays of sunlight illuminated the land with a warm, glowing tone, farmers felt comforted, knowing stable air persisted. But when dusk arrived with a faded, cool tone, even with no clouds visible, farmers recognized instability in the atmosphere. The horizon continued to play a crucial role at dawn and dusk. Distant hills that appeared sharply outlined during dawn meant dry, clear conditions. If those hills appeared softened or blurred at dawn, storms were likely within 24 hours. At dusk, the same rule applied. A crisp horizon suggested steady weather. A faded one suggested upcoming moisture. The horizon's clarity became one of the most important long-term indicators for farmers, especially when combined with color and light behavior. Farmers also listened carefully to sound during these transitions. Morning air carried sound differently depending on humidity. If a farmer could hear distant village noises unusually clearly at dawn, it almost always meant moisture was rising. The same phenomenon occurred at dusk. On calm, clear evenings, sound traveled normally. But when moisture thickened in the air, voices, tools, and animal noises traveled further and echoed differently. The quality of sound became a subtle but extremely reliable forecasting tool. Even birds changed their behavior in ways tied to dawn and dusk light. Birds that sang loudly and confidently at dawn signaled calm conditions. When birds remained quiet or began singing later than usual, farmers sensed heavy air or incoming weather. At dusk, birds settling earlier than usual or flying erratically hinted at pressure changes. These patterns became so familiar that farmers incorporated them into their daily routines, learning, sometimes unconsciously, to link light behavior with animal responses. Another overlooked but powerful indicator was the presence of halos around the sun. Farmers noticed that when the rising sun carried a soft halo, often faint, subtle, but unmistakable, it predicted rain. Sun halos at dawn meant moisture suspended high in the atmosphere. At dusk, a similar halo meant moisture was traveling toward them for the next day. These halos were not mystical signs. They were accurate readings of ice crystals or water vapor scattering light. Farmers didn't need to understand the science. They simply observed outcomes year after year. Dawn dew patterns were equally insightful. Heavy dew on grass during clear mornings meant the night air had cooled steadily, signaling fair weather. Lack of dew meant clouds or moisture had trapped heat overnight, often a sign of rain or storms. Dew that evaporated quickly after sunrise meant warm, dry conditions. Dew that lingered meant humid air. Farmers read dew almost as carefully as they read the sky, combining its behavior with dawn colors and horizon clarity to predict the day ahead. Frost patterns at dawn created another layer of prediction. Even before winter arrived, the slightest early frost hinted at shifting air masses. Farmers learned that frost appearing unevenly, heavy in some places, absent in others, meant unstable weather. Frost forming clean and evenly meant stable, cold air. Frost melting slowly meant humid days. Frost melting quickly meant dry, clear air. Dusk offered similar insights through the cooling process. How quickly the land cooled after sunset mattered enormously. Rapid cooling signaled dry air and calm weather. Slow cooling signaled moisture building and the possibility of overnight fog or rain. Farmers walked outside after the sun dipped below the horizon and simply felt the temperature shift. Their bodies became instruments, finely tuned to the smallest atmospheric hints. Perhaps the most extraordinary part of dawn and dusk forecasting was how farmers combined these countless details effortlessly. A reddish dawn plus blurred horizon plus lingering mist equals storms. A golden dusk plus sharp horizon plus vibrant glow equals clear skies. A blue dawn with weak shadows plus a faint morning halo equals rain. Soft orange dusk plus crisp shadows plus long-lasting glow equals calm conditions. They did not make these connections consciously. They absorbed them from childhood, from parents and grandparents, from daily life woven into the rhythm of the sky. They lived inside these transitions. Their days began and ended with the sky's messages. Dawn and dusk were not decorations chosen by nature. They were tools, guides, teachers. And what is remarkable today is that we still feel remnants of this ancient knowledge. Many people sense upcoming storms when the sky turns reddish at the wrong moment. Many feel calm when sunset glows warmly and evenly. Many pause at dawn when mist behaves strangely. Many notice when shadows appear too soft or too sharp. We do not rely on these signs anymore, but the body remembers. The ancestors watched the sky, and their ability to read it lives quietly in us, waiting for the world to slow down enough for us to notice again. Dawn and dusk continue to whisper truths about the coming weather, just as they did centuries ago. The sky still writes its daily messages in color, light, and shadow. The question is only whether anyone pauses long enough to read them. As our long, gentle journey through the ancient world of weather prediction comes to a close, something becomes clear, something soft, almost comforting. Long before instruments, before measurements, before forecasts delivered in numbers and charts, people relied on a form of knowledge that was as natural as breathing. They read the land, the sky, the wind, the animals, the plants, the horizon, the softness or sharpness of light. They listened not with devices, but with patience. They understood not with formulas, but with familiarity. The world itself was their teacher, and they learned its lessons with deep, unhurried attention. The farmers of the past were not scientists in the modern sense, yet they carried within them a type of wisdom that we have slowly drifted away from. Their senses were finely tuned because their lives required it. A shift in wind meant a shift in their plans. A pale horizon meant a change in the harvest. A reddish dawn meant caution. A quiet dusk meant relief. They knew that the living world spoke constantly and that each whisper, each bird's movement, each change in scent, each softening of shadows, was part of a larger conversation between the earth and the sky. And now, as we look back, we can feel how much of this ancient awareness still lingers quietly inside us. We still pause when the air feels heavy. We still look up when the sky turns an unusual shade. We still notice the strange silence before a storm or the clarity after rain. These instincts are the remnants of a shared past, echoes of generations who lived in rhythm with the natural world. We may rely on forecasts now, but the old language of the earth has never gone silent. It waits patiently, ready to reveal itself to anyone who slows down long enough to notice. If this long, soothing journey helped you relax, learn something new, or simply drift into a quieter state of mind, I gently invite you to support the channel. A soft like, a calm subscribe, or a thoughtful comment helps more than you know. Thank you for spending this peaceful stretch of time here, exploring forgotten knowledge with such curiosity. Until our next quiet journey together, rest well, breathe deeply, and may the sky above you reveal its quiet secrets, just as it did for those who came long before us.